This is Beyond the Business. Blind Spot.
If we step back and look at what has been happening in the global economy over the past decade, one of the most important shifts is happening quietly inside supply chains. It is not a single event and it does not have a single date. It is gradual rearrangement of where things are made and how they move across the world and how companies think about the risk. For almost 30 years, the logic of global manufacturing followed a very clear pattern. Production was distributed across the world in search of the lowest possible cost. Components could be produced in one country, assembled in another one, and shipped to the consumers thousands of kilometers away. Logistics became the invisible system connecting all of it. China became the center of that system. Factories across coastal China grew into some of the largest industrial zones of the planet. For many global companies, China was not only a manufacturing hub but the foundation of the entire supply chain strategy. It combined industrial capacity, skilled labor, infrastructure, and expert logistics in one place. For a long time, this system appeared stable. Shipping costs were relatively low, trade agreements expanded global markets, multinational companies optimized production networks to reduce costs and increase efficiency. Goods could move from factory to consumer with a remarkable predictability. But large systems rarely remain unchanged forever. Around the late 2010s, several pressures began to challenge the assumptions supporting this model. Some of those pressures were economic, some political, and some related to sustainability. One visible turning point came in 2018 when the United States introduced tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese imports. The official justification focused on trade imbalances and intellectual property, but the effect on global supply chains was much broader. For the first time in decades, companies began to question whether concentrating manufacturing in one country could become a strategic vulnerability. Tariffs increased costs, political tensions created uncertainty, and for companies dependent on predictable global logistics, uncertainty itself became a risk. The trade tensions did not disappear with the next administration. At the same time, the COVID 19 pandemic exposed another layer of vulnerability. Factories closed temporarily, ports became congested, containers accumulated in the wrong parts of the world. Product consumers had taken for granted suddenly became difficult to obtain. The pandemic did not destroy global supply chains, but it revealed how dependent the system had become on a small number of geographic production centers. For many companies, the lesson was clear. Efficiency alone was no longer enough. Supply chains also needed resilience. That did not necessarily mean abandoning global production, it meant diversifying it. Companies began asking whether some manufacturing could be located closer to final markets. This approach gained momentum under the label of nearshoring. For businesses serving the United States, one country naturally moved to the center of that discussion. Mexico. Mexico occupies a unique geographic and economic position in North America. It shares a long land border with the United States, one of the largest consumer markets in the world. Industrial regions in northern Mexico sit only hours away by truck from major US manufacturing and distribution zones. Trade integration also matters. What began as NAFTA evolved into the USMCA framework, which continues to support trade between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. For manufacturers, this created a powerful combination. Production could take place in Mexico, where labor costs are often lower than in the United States, while finished goods could still reach American markets quickly through land transportation. Instead of waiting for weeks for products to cross the Pacific, companies could move components and finished goods across the border in days. This advantage was not entirely new. Industrial production in northern Mexico has existed for decades through maquiladora style systems. Car parts, electronics, appliances, and industrial components have long been assembled in these zones. But in recent years, the scale of attention has changed. Companies that once relied almost exclusively on Chinese manufacturing began exploring Mexico as an alternative production platform. Investment announcements increased, industrial parks expanded, suppliers followed large manufacturers. The idea of a Mexican industrial cluster became much more visible. The shift was not driven by one factor alone. Lower labor costs played a role, but companies also care about logistics, efficiency, regulatory stability, workforce skills, infrastructure, energy availability, and environmental conditions. Mexico offered a combination of these factors. Its proximity to the United States shortened transport routes. Its existing industrial base meant supply networks were already partially developed. Trade agreements reduced barriers for cross border commerce. In other words, Mexico was not starting from zero. At the same time, sustainability was becoming a larger part of a corporate strategy. Investors, regulators, and consumers were asking harder questions about the environmental footprint of global production systems. Transportation distances, energy consumption, and industrial emissions increasingly became part of supply chain calculations. For some companies, nearshoring also appeared attractive from a sustainability perspective. Shorter transport routes could reduce shipping emissions. Regional supply networks might allow closer oversight of suppliers. But sustainability introduces complexity rather than simple answers. Moving production from one country to another does not automatically reduce environmental impact. Industrial clusters create new pressure on energy systems, water resources, and local ecosystems. When manufacturing activity grows rapidly in one region, infrastructure must expand with it. This is where the story of the Mexican industrial cluster becomes more interesting. On the surface, it appears to be a clear story of economic opportunity. Factories open, jobs are created, and regional economies grow. Logistics corridors become busier as goods move between Mexico and the United States. But beneath that visible growth lies a more complicated systems. Industrial expansions places new demands on electricity generation. Manufacturing requires reliable water supplies. Urban areas around industrial zones grow as workers move toward new employment centers. And environmental regulation must adapt to increasing industrial activity. In other words, the success of industrial cluster depends not only on factories, but on the broader systems that support them, like energy, water, transport, urban infrastructure, environmental management. That question becomes more concrete when we look inside the industrial system itself. The car industry is perhaps the clearest example. Over the past 2 decades, Mexico has become one of the world's largest vehicle exporters. Major manufacturers operate factories across several regions, producing vehicles primarily for export to the United States, Canada, and other international markets. Around these factories, suppliers cluster tightly. Automotive factoring requires thousands of components, and if even one part is delayed, production can slow or stop. When suppliers operate within the same region, transportation distances shrink dramatically, and production can be organized around highly synchronized logistics systems. The electronics sector offers another example. Northern manufacturing cities have long hosted electronics factories producing consumer devices, telecommunications equipment, and computer components. Components arrive from abroad, final assembly takes place in Mexico, and finished goods move quickly into North American markets. Medical device manufacturing has also grown significantly, particularly near the US border. Aerospace production has expanded in central Mexico through clusters focused on aircraft components and engine parts. This diversification matters. It means that the Mexican industrial cluster is not dependent on a single sector. Car manufacturing may dominate exports, but electronics, aerospace, appliances, machinery, and medical devices all contribute to the broader ecosystem. Maquiladora model remains an important part of that system. Factories near the border import components, perform assembly or integration, and re-export finished goods. Over the time, many of these facilities evolved from simple assembly operations into more complex manufacturing environments. The result is one of the busiest commercial corridors in the world. Goods move across the US Mexico border every day at enormous scale. Trucks carry components south and finished goods north. Rail networks support long distance freight movement inside Mexico. Industrial parks near border zones increasingly function as full production ecosystems, combining factories, warehouses, custom services, and logistics depots in one place. But as an investment accelerates, the system faces another test. Industrial growth is never just about production. It also creates pressure on the regions that host it. That pressure is especially visible in energy, water, and urban development. Northern Mexico provides a clear example. Many of the regions attracting new manufacturing investments are located in relatively dry climates. States in the north have long experienced periods of water stress. For years, this was manageable because industrial activity grew more gradually. But rapid expansions changes that balance. Monterrey became one of the clearest examples. In 2022, the region experienced a severe drought that sharply reduced water levels in reservoirs supplying the metropolitan area. Monterrey is not only a major city with millions of residents, it is also one of Mexico's most important industrial centers. As water levels fell, authorities introduced rationing. In some neighborhoods, residents received water only for limited hours each day. The situation exposed a difficult question at the heart of nearshoring. If industrial growth continues to accelerate in water stressed regions, how will infrastructure support both factories and cities? Energy systems present another dimension of pressure. Manufacturing facilities require stable and reliable electricity. Assembly lines, robotics, cooling systems, and warehousing all depend on continuous power. As industrial clusters expand, demand for reliable electricity rises quickly. But grids don't expand automatically. Transmission lines, substations, and generation capacity all require time, capital, and policy coordination. In several industrial regions, manufacturers have already faced delays in connecting new facilities to the grid. Energy policy adds another layer. Debates over state owned versus private generation and the speed of renewable energy development directly affect how quickly new industrial demand can be supported. For multinational companies, this matters even more because many have sustainability targets of their own. When choosing locations for new factories, they increasingly examine whether renewable energy sources can support lower carbon production. The environmental dimension goes beyond water and electricity. Manufacturing generates waste materials, chemical byproducts, and emissions that must be managed carefully. As industrial clusters grow, environmental monitoring systems must grow with them. Local authorities must ensure that standards are maintained even as production expands. Urban growth adds still another layer. As factories create employment opportunities, workers relocate. Cities surrounding industrial zones grow quickly, housing expands, transportation demand rises. Public services must accommodate growing population. Tijuana offers a good example. Industrial growth there has been accompanied by rapid population expansion, new residential development, and increased transportation pressure between industrial areas and urban districts. This is why industrial clusters should never be understood as factories alone. They are ecosystems. They combine manufacturing, infrastructure, resources, and human communities evolving together. And that is also why the Mexican case matters beyond Mexico. What is happening there is a part of a broader reorganization of global manufacturing geography. Europe has begun exploring its own version of this transformation through reshoring and strategic industrial policy, especially in semiconductors and batteries. The details differ, but the underlying logic is similar. Reduce dependence on distant production hubs, build regional capacity closer to major markets, and strengthen resilience. So, if we step back from the individual factories and investment announcements, a larger pattern begins to emerge. Global manufacturing is not disappearing, it is reorganizing. The old model concentrated production in a limited number of giant manufacturing zones serving the entire world. The new model appears more regional. Companies are building multiple hubs closer to major consumer markets. North America is strengthening its industrial integration through Mexico, and Europe is rebuilding strategic industries of its own. At first glance, this seems logical. Shorter supply chains reduce exposure to long distance disruption. Regional production allows faster response to changes in demand. And governments gain more confidence when critical production exists with their own broader economic zones. But systems thinking forces us to look beyond those immediate benefits. Because when production moves geographically, the pressure created by that production moves as well. Factories require energy, industrial processes require water, logistic systems require infrastructure, and cities grow around manufacturing clusters, with the environmental impacts accumulated where industrial activity is concentrated. Supply chains don't eliminate pressure from the system, they redistribute it. That is the blind spot in many conversations about nearshoring. The public narrative focuses on economic opportunity and resilience, but the hidden part of the story is the burden carried by the surrounding systems. That does not make nearshoring a mistake. It simply means it must be understood as a system challenge rather than purely economic one. Industrial strategy cannot focus only on factories. It must also consider the networks that sustain them: energy, water, transport, urban development, environmental management. If those elements evolve together, industrial clusters can become stable engines of economic development. If they evolve unevenly, tensions will eventually emerge. And that is where this story ultimately leads. The rise of the Mexican industrial cluster is often described as a simple shift in manufacturing location. Factories moving closer to the United States, supply chains becoming shorter, production relocating from one country to another. But the deeper reality is more interesting. Global manufacturing is not retreating, it is reorganizing. Instead of one dominant center supplying the world, production is gradually distributing itself across several major regional systems. Mexico is becoming one of the clearest examples of that shift. A manufacturing platform positioned between global supply chains and one of the largest consumer markets in the world. A place where logistics, industry, infrastructure, and urban growth meet. And that is what makes this story important. It is not only about where factories go next, it is about how the systems supporting those factories evolve with them. Because supply chains are never just about the goods, they are about systems. And understanding those systems is what allows us to see the real story behind the movement of production.